Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to present to you today on preventing burnout and compassion fatigue. I am Alexandria Callahan, the manager for our behavioral health department at City of Hope in Chicago. I've been with the company for about over 15 years. So I'm very passionate about this piece, especially when it comes to compassion fatigue, because I know that, all of our caregivers and patients have huge hearts, and this is something that, impacts all of us. So when we're looking at, burnout and compassion fatigue, we might not really understand what that is. And some of those symptoms actually come across as stress. When you're looking at this diagram, it really shows that breakdown of how stress affects our body, mind, emotions, and behaviors. And they're all connected in there. If you're feeling that tension in your shoulders, it's most likely impacting another functioning of your body. You might be in a little bit more pain, you're not thinking clearly, you're not sleeping well, you're noticing that you're a little bit more irritable, or you're just exhausted and you can't get enough sleep, or, like I mentioned, that sleep just is interrupted. It can also lead to, some of those maladaptive coping skills where you might have one, you used to have one glass of wine at dinner, and now you're noticing that you're having two or three, or you've taken up smoking or you've increased your smoking. There could also be a loss of appetite, definitely a loss of the sex drive, libido. So there's a lot of different changes that happen within the body that really tell us that stress is happening. And as we can see, it's not just in our head. It's definitely a systemic impact on the entire being. And one of the main things we emphasize, especially in behavioral health, is the importance of that support. And support is for everybody. A lot of people have a stigma around going to therapy or getting that support or having that safe space to process things. And especially when we're dealing with cancer, that is an important piece in this, is knowing that you have an area, a department that you can go to say, hey, this is a stress outside of my normal wheelhouse. I don't know how to cope with that. We also know that, stress is biochemical. There's a cortisol release that happens in our body when we're in stress. So that's what puts us in that fight or flight mode. I often give the example of if you're hiking through the woods and, a bear comes up to you. Some people do freeze, others like, start running, that panicky. It's that survival mode. And that's, our response. And it's an important thing. We need that stress response when we're dealing with, situations that require us to be in that hyper alert state. If you're driving down the expressway and there's traffic whipping around you, you don't want to be relaxed in a meditative state because you could get into an accident. So you want to be a little bit more alert. Certainly to navigating the airports, I got to get from point A to point B, especially if you have a connecting flight. That stress is what helps guide us. And athletes, they have that stress to get to the finish line. I'm going to push my body that much further. So we see that too, in one of our patients. There's that stress of going through cancer treatment, but I've got to push myself through, that fatigue to get to these activities or to keep my body functioning. Uh, we also know too that stress, too much stress, impacts the body in some of those examples that I gave earlier. You have the body aches, or you pick up those maladaptive coping skills. A lot of my patients, especially when they're stressed, they talk about having nightmares, or that trouble sleeping, an increase in anxiety, even feeling just emotionally raw. And those are all things that you really need to observe in yourself to make sure, if you are experiencing them, you're saying, okay, what do I do to help with that? And we will get to that later. So looking at burnout, the definition of burnout is a state of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. So good examples of burnout is, at work, especially, in healthcare, or, policemen, those, high moving disciplines. They have a lot of, risk of burnout or burnout, just because you're constantly, taking care of other people. You're in that, fight or flight mode, making sure that you're getting from point A to point B and taking care of a lot of things. Compassion fatigue, on the other hand, is that physical, mental, and emotional response to the stress of interpersonal interactions with people who have experienced a trauma. So this has to do with our relationships. It's being overwhelmed by what people are telling you. And it's almost like taking on, their experience. And that's something, especially, I talk with our cancer fighters ambassadors all the time and say, make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And although you're present and you're holding that space for others to talk about their cancer journey and experience, you are also making sure that you're taking that moment to say, okay, how is this impacting my body? Am I taking this on, or am I just holding that space and giving it back to them? So some of our warning signs of burnout are feeling helplessness, defeated, or hopeless, disengagement or detachment. I've had a lot of people just say, I'm not motivated to do anything anymore, or just, I've had enough, I'm done. I have one patient, she has a lot of stress around her. She's a caregiver. Her son is, autistic and low functioning. So she's primary caregiver for him, her father's sick. She has a lot of moving pieces. And the other day when I was talking with her, she's like, I'm just done. I'm exhausted. I am done. Her immune system dropped so much that, she has gotten, chronic head colds and things. And she's like, there's so much happening in my body and I know it's giving me those signs. So that's important to look at as you're navigating through for yourself too. That decreased satisfaction or sense of accomplishment. And going back to, some of those physical things I mentioned with stress, the headaches, backaches, muscles, the change in appetite or sleep, those maladaptive coping skills, they creep in all the time. Even to overeating or, going to those comfort foods, which are, the Twinkies and Ho-Hos, the sweets that, we shouldn't be eating. And, even, the potato chips. So it really is looking at, the choices that we're making when we're feeling out of control and trying to gain some of that control back. And then those signs of compassion fatigue. Vicarious trauma is a huge one. So this is really where we take on the experience of others, and we might not even experience it ourselves. I use the example a lot. I had a patient, it was a few years after actually 9/11 happened, and she lived on the West Coast, knew no one on the East Coast or, anything that happened with, the Twin Towers and everything. And she felt the pain and the suffering watching those videos. And she said that she found herself glued to the TV all the time. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that because, there was a huge part in our history. And for her, she took on so much of it that it impacted her, where she was having nightmares. And that's the part where I always tell people, like, you want to make sure that even though you're observing those things, you still have that self-care in there. You're still able to tease apart and say, okay, this is happening, but I'm not going to absorb it all into me. I'm understanding what's happening, but I'm not, taking on that pain, that trauma, the nightmare piece. And I know that's kind of an extreme example, but certainly too, if you're talking with other patients going through cancer treatment, I know our patients are the best source, even for our staff. And we say, okay, well, what are you experiencing, or what have you found to help counter that? So a lot of, our patients will talk to each other and say, oh, you know what, I ate this after that treatment and it actually helped cut my nausea, or, I put this on my skin and help with that radiation burn. So those are great things to share. It's just, when you're sharing those stories too, or you're hearing things about, people possibly having progression or passing away, it's the not taking that on and making that your reality. So, and then we also see, similar with burnout, that mood and cognition disruption. There could be an increase in cynicism or sarcasm, intrusive imagery. So it's going back to, those nightmares, different thoughts that are coming in, a loss of hope. So especially if we take on too much, we can actually put ourselves into a state of depression, or just feeling that, there's no point in moving forward. And those are, scary and kind of dangerous places to get into because you can get lost in that. And then of course, the exhaustion, sleeplessness, and, our work, our performance, even just our ability to be present with others is affected. So when we're looking at ourselves, it's important to, really look at and recognize that, burnout and compassion fatigue are impacting everything. And it could be from one aspect of your life. So it might be something from work, but it impacts your personality, the environment, and your lifestyle. So no matter what, we navigate through all of these places. So if we're having, that burnout or compassion fatigue in just one area, we know that we can't be present in any of the other areas. So I'm going to have you take a moment to really assess your current state, to really see like where you're at. So, ask yourself, am I on the road to burnout and or compassion fatigue? What are my strengths and challenges? How am I taking care of myself? I often ask a lot of, my patients, even the caregivers, what do you do for self-care? And some of them say, I don't do anything, or, I've never had a stress like this in my life. So I never really had to think about that. So that's important too, to say, am I even taking care of myself? And of course, how would I want to take care of myself? What does that look like? You know, is there, something that you've always wanted to do? I have, some people say, I'd love to get back to the gym. I just don't feel like I have that in place or the ability to do that right now. So it's looking at, that self-care piece as something that your body needs for that recuperation rather than something you would like to do. It's more of a must have in our lives. So we're going to explore a little bit more too about what I can do to better take care of myself. So as we look at prevention, awareness is a huge thing. Being aware of your body, how it's responding, what's different now. Am I, really feeling a lot of stress, or am I having some of those symptoms we talked about earlier? And of course, getting that balance in there. So balancing, work and life, treatment in life, even, how much you extend yourself out. A lot of us, tend to be caregivers too. So it's really challenging to say no, especially to people that you love and care about. And if you are always the go-to person, that's a huge role change. So it's saying, I actually had one patient who said, he's like, I can't say no, but I have started telling people not right now. Or, started giving them resources and saying, well, this is what I would do. So, and kind of delegating a little bit more, or even empowering those people to say, okay, well, this is something that I typically do for you, but let's see if you can do it now. And that's a really great way to get that balance in there too. And of course, connections, looking at those connections in our lives. Who are the people that build you up, and who are the people that don't necessarily tear you down, but the interactions that you have with them might be a little bit more exhausting. Yeah, I have some patients too that have talked about, that family member that they know like their heart's in the right place. It's just say, they're always sending me all these articles or doing this research. They're telling me I should eat this and not that. And that can get overwhelming too. Or, the people that, you might have been their sounding board. And now, if they're calling you up and complaining about a lot of stuff, it's just impacting you differently. It's, especially if you're fatigued, you might not have the strength to be that sounding board. So it's not necessarily saying cut them out of your life. I've had some people say that's what I needed to do. But, I really tell people, it's again going to that balance thing. It's setting those healthy boundaries, saying, okay, you know what, I can only talk with you for 10 minutes. And when that 10 minutes is up, it's ending the conversation, saying, we're going to have to continue this later. So, and that's really a huge thing. And it's challenging. It can sound pretty easy to say it, and I know it is challenging. But it is giving yourself that time though to say, okay, this is as much energy as I have right now. And I'm going to show you a quick video.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Yeah, I absolutely love that video because it really shows us, um, that piece that I think all of us have, that seeking for connection. And especially as we're going through, cancer diagnosis, treatment, whether you're the patient or the caregiver, there's a vulnerability with that. And there's a lot of fear included with it because we don't know what's going to happen. Cancer is unpredictable. We can't even say you're going to respond exactly like this to treatment because every body is different and everyone responds differently. So being able to really be present with someone and say, okay, I get it. I've been there, makes a huge difference for people. And I think too, going back to, those connections and setting those healthy boundaries in relationships, that's something too. A lot of times I've had patients say that, their family were trying to just make them feel better. So they're just like, oh, well, just keep fighting, keep pushing. And, the patient saying, I'm tired, I feel sick, I don't have the energy. So, it's important too, whether, we're a patient or a caregiver, is to find that way to communicate with each other so that we truly understand the experience of the other person. So some things too that you can do for, that prevention piece, seeking support. I mentioned, our counselors are, wonderful, having, support even in your church, your community, places like that. Even, support groups. There's actually, I always feel silly, like giving YouTube and, Facebook as, resources for people. But, now, especially since, the pandemic, there's been, an increase of a lot of, services that are out there and a lot of amazing support groups that are found on that social media platform. And even with them too, you might find that you have to set boundaries because there's going to be some people that might monopolize the, support groups or, might post things that don't really resonate with you. And that's one of the nice things too, because if it doesn't resonate with you, you could say, well, that doesn't apply. I can skip over that and go to something else. Adopting daily habits that support your mind and body are important too. So every time I meet with a new patient, I always encourage them, even the caregivers too, to do one thing each day for themselves. So I always say, if the doctor told you you have to take this pill every single day for your health, you would do it hands down because you're like, all right, I'm fighting cancer. This is what I need to do. So from my perspective as a therapist, I always say you need to do one thing every single day for yourself, whether that's taking a deep breath, doing a body scan in the morning, setting a timer so that you go for a walk around the block or something. So it doesn't have to be anything huge or elaborate. It could be 30 seconds or, it could be 20 minutes to an hour. It's just carving that time out to say, this is designated, especially for me to check in with my body and take care of myself. Again, those establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries, creating relaxation rituals, definitely too around sleep. I have so many patients that say that sleep is just really challenging for them. So, one thing we always say, shut the electronics off at least a half hour before you go to bed and really focus on, that self-care thing, whether you take a warm shower, soak your feet in some Epsom salt, read your scripture, do some meditation, even just gentle movement, something like yoga or Tai Chi, nothing that gets the heart rate up, but something that helps you connect with your breathing and help the body decompress. Reevaluate your goals and priorities. And I think this naturally happens too once you get a cancer diagnosis. So I've had a lot of patients say things that I really thought were important aren't as important anymore. Those little things that don't really bother me. They kind of roll off my back. I'm looking more at the bigger picture, or those future things that hold a lot more weight. Taking time off. So, that's maybe taking time off from work. Even, for our cancer fighter ambassadors, I always say it's okay if you need to pause, if, it's got too much or you have too much happening in your life where you don't feel you can be present to support another patient. That's okay. And definitely encouraged, just because that is part of your self care. And actively grieving your losses. So that's something that a lot of people don't think about. I've had quite a few patients that, especially after, surgeries, I see them inpatient and they say like, I don't know why I'm crying. And I had one, and she had the BRCA mutation. So she did a double mastectomy. At the same time, she was actually in for gynecological cancer. So she had a complete abdominal hysterectomy, and she lost everything all at once. And she realized, she's like, oh my gosh, she's like, my body is grieving. There's a lot of changes that happened. She lost all of the parts that, physically, she said defined her as a female. I mean, she had her kids, she breastfed them. She's like, all of that was gone with one surgery. So it's important too to realize that you might cognitively not think that, you're sad or you have anything to grieve, but your body is energetically also looking for those pieces that might not be there or have changed. The chemotherapy impacts you systemically, radiation, impacts the tissue and some of the organs in that area. So it is important to give yourself that opportunity to grieve those side effects and things from treatment. And then also too, the things you might have missed out on, especially with a compromised immune system. I've had a lot of patients say, well, I'm not going to, that concert with my family, even though I really wanted to. It's my favorite band, but there's going to be, 5,000 people there. I don't know what I'll be exposed to. I'm going to miss that graduation. I can't go to, that basketball game. I can go to the baseball game, but I can't sit with them. I have to be off on the distance. Whatever it is, there's a lot of grief that happens with that too, because you can't just get up and go like you're used to. There's those limitations or the precautions that we say, well, I'm fighting for my life and I want to stay safe. So these are the things that I can't fully engage in the same way. And, some of those wellness practices too, I mentioned doing a daily practice, of course, the regular counseling or therapy, mindfulness, and meditation. A lot of those kind of are hand in hand. Mindfulness is really about being present in the moment. And, so when I talk about being present with other people, feeling that empathy, it is, saying, okay, well, what's happening in this moment? And, what's happening in the room around me? What's happening in my body as I'm sitting with this person, as I'm listening to this presentation, the different shifts and changes we have. And meditation, it comes in many different forms. So a lot of times when we think of meditation, we go right to that picture we see of the person with their legs crossed and they're humming. That is absolutely one form of meditation. Prayer is another one. Going for a walk is a meditation. So if you're doing more of a moving meditation, it's going back to that mindfulness. It's keeping yourself present in the moment so that you're aware of the birds flying overhead, or the weight of your right foot versus the left foot as it's hitting the ground. Are there cars driving by, or are you in the woods? Are there different animals? Things like that. So it's being present in that and trying to shut the mind off from jumping from thought to thought. I call it the monkey mind. You're really jumping from branch to branch, and it's saying, okay, I'm going to stay present in this moment and really see how it's impacting me. Physical exercise and movement. Reiki, it's a form of energy massage, and of course, massage, acupuncture, Qigong, yoga, Tai Chi, all of those things are really great to get that balance into the body. And finding your own stress busters. I mean, certainly too, this is a very minimal list to all the things that are out there. I know even people now have the apps on their phones and their watches. I have one patient, she's like, I don't have to worry about not remembering to breathe because my Apple Watch will tell me when I need to. So, it's really taking in that the technology piece too, that's right at our fingertips, and saying, okay, what can I start utilizing to incorporate into my life so that I am making sure I'm taking care of myself. And that's also too with like creative arts therapy. So dance, art, music therapy, drama therapy, those are all things that are great ways to express as well. And one of my favorite interventions that I use is the Healthy Mind Platter. So if you met with our nutritionist, they will tell you to eat the rainbow, and this is the rainbow for your mind, your overall well-being. So looking at it, that focus time, that's kind of that meditation time, being able to focus on, some of the challenges you might have, allow yourself to decompress and, look at those to-do lists, not in a way to increase the anxiety, but to say, okay, these are some of the things that, I need to get done. And let me, spread that out a little bit. Playtime. This is one that, especially as adults, we don't tend to engage in as much. We're trying to get from point A to point B, especially get from treatment to doctor's appointments to work and take care of the kids, family, whatever it might be. And this is so important. I always joke around with people. I say, if you give a kid a cardboard box, they'll go outside and play for hours. But no one is handing cardboard boxes out to adults. We kind of outgrow that piece. And it's so important to be able to have that laughter, that carefree creativity in our daily life. And that can even be, adult coloring books or, playing card games. I know a lot of people, especially after the pandemic, I've heard more so that people have, once a month, it's a family game night where they shut off all the electronics and they bring out the old board games or card games, things like that. And that, segues with connecting time, making sure that we are still connecting with those people around us that build us up, help us to, grow into that best version of ourselves and nurturing us as we're navigating through. And physical time, just making sure that you are moving your body, keeping that blood flow going. It's not necessarily that you have to go to the gym on a regular basis. That's for some people. Others, it's, well, I went for a walk, or I do at a home yoga practice. It's just things that are keeping the body healthy and moving. Time in, making sure that you're taking that time to focus inwardly. A lot of times too, we spend our days so externally focused, especially if we are a caregiver, that we forget to say, okay, well, what's happening in my body right now? Or I didn't even realize how stressed I was until I tried to relax and I realized my shoulders were all the way up into my ears. So it's really taking that time to say, okay, let me just, check in, see what's going on. That downtime is that non-focus. You don't have a goal, kind of let your mind daydream, wander, just having that relaxation. Oftentimes, if you just sit outside and you're staring up at the clouds, or, if you're laying out on the beach and you get lost and you look at the time, it's like, wow, I didn't even realize that, an hour and a half went by. That's an important thing too. And of course, sleep, making sure that we get enough sleep to refuel our bodies and help us to feel refreshed. And that too is a delicate balance. Sometimes we can sleep too much and then you wake up and you're still tired, or you don't sleep enough and you have that same response. So it is making sure that you find kind of that sweet spot. And it can be different every single day depending on what you've done. So I want to thank you again for joining me. As always, if there's any questions, you can always reach out to the Cancer Fighters team. They know how to get a hold of me to keep any conversations going. And I hope this helps you as you're supporting yourself and others through cancer journey.